Have you ever sat in that heavy silence at a family dinner? Here on Human Stories, we retell those moments, honest, everyday, sometimes controversial. Every story is a mirror. Subscribe, join the conversation, and maybe find a little healing. The landline on my kitchen wall rang like a relic clearing its throat. Out here on the Oregon coast, that phone and a weather radio were the only things that never lied to me. I wiped sea salt from my hands and picked up. "We're dropping the kids with you next week," Sloan said. "No, hello." Her voice was crisp polished like her glass and chrome life 2 states away. "Mark and I have flights to Santorini. It's perfect timing since you're, between things." I looked through the big A-frame window. A pair of bald eagles rode a slab of wind above Seabreak Inlet. My little cabin kept its shoulders low against the bluff cedar-scented roof, salted white. On the door hung a tide chart and a pencil on a string. "I heard you," I said. "Great, Monday morning. Also, would you mind putting away your jars and projects? You know how Lila gets about, oddities." I glanced at the shelves, a pelican skull, a mason jar of black sand, gleaming like ground pepper, a radio crystal set, wired with copper that glowed faintly when the weather band hummed. "I'll make sure the house is safe," I said, which wasn't the same as hiding it. "Perfect. Thanks, Eleanor." She never called me Nell. The line clicked dead. Gulls outside stitched the air with their thin laughter. I set the receiver down and looked over my table-filled notebooks, stacked like pancakes, magnifiers, a roll of waxed canvas, a small knife I used for whittling driftwood into spoons. The tide chart showed minus water the following week. The sea would peel itself back and show its undersides. I didn't make the place childproof. I made it ready. I lined 3 old canvas shoulder bags on the bench and filled them like I was packing for a small expedition. Waterproof notebooks, pencils, a hand lens, a braided length of paracord, a tin whistle, a bandana. I sharpened a carpenter's pencil and scribbled house rules on a card. Solar first for the fridge and lights. No streaming, shoes off on the cedar, leave what you don't need better than you found it. I taped the card near the light switches. In the evenings I fed the sourdough jar just flour and water and wild yeast that knew my kitchen. The starter lifted as steady as the moon. I set 3 bunks in the loft with clean quilts. From the shed I carried in a milk crate of well-thumbed guidebooks, tide pool creatures, shorebirds, native plants, knots, and splices. The only glowing screen in the room was the weather radio's green eye. Monday arrived sharp and blue. The wind laid down just enough to let the inlet show a clean reflection of the ridge. I heard the SUV before I saw it, the civilized growl of money and timing and calendars. It rolled into my pullout and stopped with a neat puff of zest. Mark stepped out all shoulders in apology. Sloan followed in a sun hat broad as a serving tray. The rear doors didn't open right away. Inside I could feel children refusing things. It's a particular stillness. "Mom," Mark said, forcing a smile. "Place looks sturdy." "It's here," I said. The back door flung, and Leo tumbled out, 8 years and all elbows hugging a backpack printed with astronauts. He did a quick scan for a television the way a bird checks for hawks. Lila emerged with a rolling suitcase whose tiny wheels did not care for gravel. She slapped at her arm and scowled at a leaf that dared to touch her. Last was Ray, 15 headphones draped around her neck, her phone held up like a divining rod hoping for bars. "Do you have Wi-Fi?" Ray asked, skipping hello. "No," I said. "We have the Pacific." Sloan's smile tightened. "They're used to certain baselines. White noise machines, vitamins, screen time limits. Leo can't have red dye. His pediatrician says it spikes his activity." "I don't keep red dye," I said. "The ocean does a fine white noise." Mark checked his watch, then his guilt. "We should go soon. Honey, say hello." "Hi," Ray muttered, eyes still on her phone, which was already an orphan here. "Hi," I said. "I'm Nell." I reached for the suitcases. Inside the cabin took them in the way the inlet takes drift, without ceremony. The A-frame's ribbed ceiling, the table scarred with old maps, the iron stove with its plight heat, and a rope of drying bull kelp hung by the back door like a giant question mark. Through the triangular window, the bar of the inlet showed a lick of white where the current shouldered itself thin. Leo beelined to the kitchen and poked at the radio crystal set. "Does this play music? Like, can it do beats?" "It plays weather," I said. "Sometimes fishermen." He considered that. "Do they cuss?" "Not on Channel 3. Lila trailed her fingertips along the cedar wall. "It smells like pencils," she said. "That's a compliment," I told the boards. Ray plugged her phone into the one outlet by the bookshelf. "Even if there's no service, I can use my playlist," she said. "You can," I said. "After sundown, we watch our power. The panels don't like the dark any more than we do." Sloan handed me a folder, typed schedules, a list of vitamins, a phone number for the villa in Greece. "Emergency contest," she said, as if I'd invented emergencies. "Also, Leo's therapist says transitions are hard for him." Same Leo said, already opening a notebook from the canvas bag I'd set aside for him. "What's this magnifying glass for?" "Whatever needs to be bigger," I said. We did the business of goodbyes. Sloan hugged each child as if she were fitting them back into their boxes. Mark's hug was better bone and blood, quick and tight. When the SUV reversed, Lila's chin wobbled. Ray looked at her screen as it failed to fill. Leo waved at the tide chart like it was a friend. Silence afterward has a weight. The house remembered how to breathe. "What do we do now?" Leo asked, voice too loud for the room. "Shoes by the door," I said. "Hands here." I poured cold water into 3 tin cups and set them on the table. "You can explore what belongs to you." I nudged the canvas bags toward each child. "If it's in your bag, it's yours to use. If it's on a shelf, ask." They sorted themselves. Leo tried the whistle, one plaintive note that made a gull bark outside. Lila found the rolled bandana and tied it as if the cabin had deputized her. Ray drifted toward the shelves and took down a shorebird guide. She sat cross-legged and read the key like it was the beginning of a code. I made lunch without making a point of it. Cheddar apples, a pot of chowder from last night's clams, bread warmed in the stove. We ate at the map-scarred table. Leo asked if I had chips. I didn't. Lila sipped water and said it tasted like a creek, which meant clean. Ray's phone pulsed silently on the floor beside her boot. "Is that a skull?" Lila pointed at the pelican's long beak on my shelf. "It is," I said. "I found it after a winter blow." Sometimes the beach returns what you didn't ask for. "Gross," she said, then softer, also cool. After lunch, we did the slow domestic work that makes a place sized for more than one. Quilts shaken, bunk ladder, checked sand, swept from the door seam with the back of a hand brush. Leo inventoried the colored pencils in his bag, counting notches, naming the worn stubs. Lila discovered the loft window crank and opened it just enough to let the surf's hush roll up along the rafters. Ray turned the weather radio's dial until the NOAA voice arrived flat and certain, speaking of swell height and bar conditions in a monotone that made truth sound like an instrument. When the afternoon light slid long across the floorboards, the cabin decided we'd done enough. We sat for a moment that wasn't planned. The inlet breathed in, breathed out. A raven walked the fence post and gave us a comment, throaty and private. On the door, the tide chart waited, with its penciled numbers and its little moon simple as any clock. Ray thumbed her phone out of habit and watched the lock screen do nothing. She looked up, followed the sound of the surf to the open window, and listened. The house held still, making room. By dusk, the cabin had learned their names. Leo's whistle lived in the hook by the door. Lila had claimed the loft window crank and set it at the exact notch where surf and wind braided without rattling the glass. Ray kept the shorebird guide with her cup spine open at a page that showed silhouettes against a clean horizon. When I checked the tide chart before bed, tomorrow's minus tide sat on the paper like a door already unlocked. We were up before the gulls worked themselves into an argument. The inlet held the kind of quiet that lets you hear the first zipper, the first boot on the floor. I set tin mugs on the table and ladled hot water over a squeeze of lemon. The stove ticked in its slow metal way. Outside, the ridge wore a thin line of pearl where the light would find it. "Why so early?" Leo yawned into his sleeve. Because the ocean is about to show us what she hides, I said. You have 10 minutes to meet that kind of generosity. Boots, bandanas, the canvas field bags. I made sure each kid had a pencil stub in their waterproof notebook. The weather radio spoke its soft certainties swell 2 to 4 light. North wind bar calm for the moment. And then we were out the door and down the path. Cedar needles soft underfoot and the air sharp with iodine. We slid along the bluff shoulder and took the stairs cut into the sand. The ocean had stepped back. Where yesterday there had been an impression of distance and force, now there were streets and rooms, shelves of rock striped with mussels, bowls of clear water, seams of weed as bright as new pennies. Rule number 1, I said, keeping my voice low because the tide pools are a church if anything is. 2 fingers only and they stay in the water. Rule number 2, if you lift a rock, you return it exactly how it was. Rule number 3, your footsteps are sentences. Read them as you make them. Leo hopped onto a bench of stone and froze in place, pupils blown. The pool at his toes was a tiny galaxy anemones, like green glass roses, a scuttle of hermit crabs, switching houses, a chiton glued down like a shield. Lila sidled toward me, then leaned on my hip and pointed wordless at an ochre sea star tucked underneath a ledge. It looked like it had grown out of the rock itself. The little beads along the star's arms are tube feet, I said. If you watch, you'll see them move. She widened her eyes and didn't blink. Ray stayed back on higher stone, taking the scene in as if distance made it more legible. She flipped the shorebird guide open and traced a beak with her finger. When a black shape arrowed past orange, bill blazing, she didn't look to me. Black oyster catcher, she said almost to herself. She didn't smile, she let the rightness sit there unbothered. The sun lifted and the light shook itself awake in every puddle. We watched an anemone take a soft breath and close around the shadow of my fingers, a ring of tentacles conferring then loosening. Leo named a hermit crab tank and then on his own crossed the name out in his notebook and wrote unnamed temporary shell whelk. He looked at me to see if that counted as grown up. It's good field practice, I said. He didn't answer, but he stood taller. Lila negotiated the barnacle patches like a diplomat stepping through the edges of a crowd. These hurt, she said, meaning both the sharp shells and the thin squeaks they made when her boot brushed them. She put her 2 fingers in the water and held them still until a small fish tested the foreign shape. It tickles, she whispered. On a saddle of rock farther out, long beds of mussels held fast blue-black armor winking where the sun got under a hinge. We don't take anything alive, I said when Leo's hand drifted toward a shell. He withdrew it as if the mussels were already in a court protecting themselves. The tide began to turn without announcement. The edge line where water met weed pulled itself a few inches higher. I felt it first in my knees in the chilled seam where my jeans darkened. Notice what's changing, I said, not as a lesson, just so they'd get used to the habit of naming the moment you're in. Ray wrote ripples reversed in her neat, unhurried hand. When the pools refilled, we climbed the beach and walked the high line where yesterday's waves had delivered their catalog kelp ropes, a tire worn down to the idea of a circle, a fist of tangled fishing line branches rubbed pale as bone. The 3 of us dragged up a T-shaped drift of cedar and a shorter piece just right for bracing. I showed Leo how to set a notch with the small handsaw and how to take the cut slow no. Sawing yourself into a hurry, Lila held the brace with both arms and set her weight on it like she'd been building braces all her life. Ray stood on the damp sand with her notebook open and drew the way the swell shouldered around the point and unraveled into 3 clean breaks. She labeled them outer, middle, and side. Her pencil left little islands where she had to shake sand off the page. We had sandwiches at the base of the bluff, backs against the boards, the drift bench under our thighs, leaving pale cedar scent on our hands. The surf now awake and certain unstitched and restitched the same line again and again. Leo chewed like he was in a contest and pointed with the crust at a seal head that popped up and blinked, looking like a question mark answered itself. Back at the cabin, sand fell out of our cuffs like confession. We shook towels over the deck rail and brushed our socks. Lila lined the boots in descending sizes like she was setting up a scale. The starter on the counter rose in its jar, slow and domestic and stubborn. I folded flour into it and marked the level with an elastic band. When Leo asked if the bread was alive, I told him it behaved more politely than some people. We made beeswax wraps while the light wandered around the kitchen. I set a bowl of grated wax on the table and cut squares of cotton. Lila chose a print with little ferns and brushed the wax on like she was putting a quiet on a page. Leo wanted anchors and worked too fast, then slowed when he saw the wax needed time to melt into the weave. Ray didn't pick a pattern. She trimmed the edges neat and ironed for all of us, pressing and lifting, turning each square and watching the sheen go from wet to satiny. The wraps cooled into something useful without a speech about usefulness. In the lull after craft, I turned the weather radio back on. The No AA voice gave us the next 12 hours in even bars of sound. Fishermen came and went on the VHF with quick reports. Bar a little bumpy now. Crab pots, fine see you at the fuel dock. Leo stood on a chair and leaned into the radio as if he could look down its throat. Is this like spying? He asked. Listening, I said. Different sport. Lila took her new wrap to the counter and folded the heel of cheese the way I'd shown her. She smoothed the warm wax with 2 fingers and smiled when it held. It looks like a present, she said. It is, I said. To your future self? She rolled her eyes but kept smoothing. By late afternoon, the wind swung north and brushed the ridge with a firm hand. The inlet took on small muscles and the eagles traded places above it, one slightly lower than the other, as if they were keeping their own rule. I set a skillet on the stove and cooked apples with a scrape of brown sugar. The scent made the room feel like it had pulled in closer around us. We ate at the table without much commentary, maybe because the day had already given us more words than we needed. Leo drummed the spoon and didn't notice when he stopped. Lila balanced a slice of apple on her beeswax wrap and walked it up the loft ladder like a waiter trying to be quiet. Ray sat by the big window with her notebook and turned the tide lines she'd sketched into arrows, one set, gentle, one set, stubborn, both correct. When evening arrived, it did it without drama, a slow dim, a cooling of the boards, the surf stepping back into its own voice instead of ours. I rinsed sand out of the wash basin and set the tin cups to dry. The house sighed once the way it does when it has been used properly. On the hook by the door, the field bags waited, straps looped notebooks, tucked inside with their first pages filled. The tide chart on the wall showed its penciled proofs of where we'd been and when. Ray closed the shorebird guide and slid it back onto the shelf, not quite where she'd found it. She adjusted it so the spine lined up with its neighbors. Then she stood with her palm on the cover a second longer than necessary, as if she were testing whether the book still had heat. Outside the inlet lifted a slate shoulder. Inside the starter rose to the elastic band. The cabin kept its breath and gave it back, keeping pace with whatever moved through it. No faster, no slower, exactly as required. After the dishes, the evening set, like a hand on the shoulder, steady, not asking anything more. The starter in his jar domed under the elastic band. The No AA voice gave one last bulletin and slipped away to static. I checked the inlet from the deck. No wind. A sky so clear the ridge's firs showed their combed tips against a rinsed blue. Nights like that, the water remembers how to answer back when touched. Jackets, I said, not raising my voice. I lifted the PFDs from their hooks and set them in a row by the door. Leo's hands were already on his. Lila looked at the buckles, then at me, and nodded once. Ray stood by the window with her shorebird guide shut, watching the light thin to nickel. We walked the path with our paddles over our shoulders and the double kayak under my arm and Leo's, him up front, me taking the tail. The sand held the day's heat in pockets. At the edge of the inlet, the water lay black as printer's ink. A heron lifted from the eelgrass with that slow, ancient crank of wings. Leo's whisper tugged at me. Are we fishing? We're looking, I said. Same muscles. I steadied the bow and they climbed in, Leo first, Lila second, Ray last, each settling into the plastic seats as if the boat were learning their names the way the cabin had. I pushed us off and slid into the stern feet brace paddle in the wet. One stroke and the inlet wrote our secret in light. A pale blue flare licked off the blade and ran out into a fan. The kids went perfectly still, which is its own kind of shout. "Is it?" Leo started. "It is," I said. We moved in a slow figure 8 between the dock lights and the darker throat of the inlet. Every dip of the paddle lit a ghost that didn't quite trust its own brightness, then folded itself back into black. A fish streaked under us, a blue comet gone before I could point. Lila put her palm over the side and splayed her fingers, lifting a glove of sparks. She pulled her hand in and laughed under her breath, surprised at herself for making that sound. "Dinoflagellates," Ray said softly, as if she were giving the night the right label so it would keep working. "Noctiluca. You can call them that," I said. "They don't mind." We drifted closer to the eelgrass. The blades brushed the hull and lit like fuse wires. Leo dipped his paddle too fast and threw a spray. I kept us steady until his rhythm found the water slow enough to let it do the talking. Lila leaned back face up, letting the dark sky and the brightened wake share her. "Why does it light?" Leo said. Not curious in the way of asking for a speech, curious like his bones wanted a handle. "Alarm," I said. "A small thing's a way of telling the big thing to pick on someone else." Ray kept her hand in the water for a long minute. The blue ran the lengths of her fingers and disappeared at her wrist. She lifted her palm and watched it go back to regular skin. We paddled for a while without need to measure distance or time. The inlet narrowed and the bar's slow pull tugged at the boat, the way sleep tugs at a kid reading past bedtime. When we turned, the paddle tips wrote cursive backward, and still it made sense. A seal surfaced then so near I could see its whiskers bead. Its head drew a circle of blue around itself, and it looked at us with the bland intelligence of a neighbor not surprised to find your porch light on late. Back on shore, we lifted the kayak to the rack, flipped it, belly up, latched the straps. Leo hopped from one foot to the other, unwilling to give the day back. Lila rubbed her fingers together to see if any light had stuck. Ray shook water from her hand and wrote a line in her notebook, right there on the beach pencil, moving in a short, certain script. We walked the path up. The cabin's single lamp pooled honey over the table. I set the kettle on. Lila wrapped her hands around her mug and warmed the red of her knuckles. Leo asked if the water would light in a bathtub. I told him the inlet does its tricks when it wants, not when asked. Ray closed her notebook and didn't put it down the way a person keeps a jacket on even after they're indoors. Sleep took them without complaint. I checked the latch on the back door and sat a minute at the table. The paddle calluses on my palms had come back without me noticing. Morning came cool and clean as a cut apple. I packed the field bags and slid a coil of rope in mine. The weather radio gave us a north wind after noon, clear skies, all-day visibility 10 miles or better. I fried eggs and put toast under them. Leo ate his like a sandwich and didn't bother hiding his grin when the yolk got his chin. Lila cut hers in precise squares. Ray put hers on a plate, then stood to eat it by the window where she could watch the inlet surface move in rows like combed hair. We took the truck down the county road and then the dirt spur toward Cape Fear. The track threaded through spruce and hemlock, the underlayer all salal and sword fern. The fire tower stood up out of the trees like a pencil-weathered silver stairs, zigzagging against the sky. Leo craned back and whistled low, not from mischief, but because height does that to a person. "That's tall," he said. "It'll be shorter at the top," I told him, which made no sense until it did. We climbed. The stairs hummed faint when we put our full weight on them. I kept a hand when Lila wanted it and took it away when she didn't. Ray counted landings in her head, I could tell by the way her lips moved every 7th step. On the midpoint platform, we stopped to drink and let our legs understand what we were asking. From there, the ridge to the south through a blue shoulder. The ocean lay out to the west, in long, shining plains darker where the current fingered through. At the top, the cab's catwalk wrapped around like a narrow porch you didn't invite people to pass on. The door was locked as it should be, but the view was a paid-for thing, and nobody collected. Leo kept both hands on the rail and leaned out just enough to see the white seam where the bar worked. Lila took 3 breaths and let each one out slower than it went in. Ray pulled the little compass from her bag, set it flat on the chart table outside the cab window, and held her notebook up as if the compass needle could write straight on the page. "What's that line?" Lila asked, pointing toward a pale band laid along the horizon, a faint gray-like breath on a mirror. "Marine layer," I said. "A blanket the ocean tucks under the sky when it's not sure if it's done with the night." Ray stretched her arm and sighted along her thumb the way surveyors do. "Northwest swells," she said. "Wind from the north later." She drew an arrow from the edge of her paper to the center and labeled it with those words. She didn't ask if she was right. You can tell when a person asks the pencil first. We ate apples and cheddar on the leeward side where the sun found us. Leo tried to throw a crumb and watched it blow up and back, laughing when it came at his face. Lila dipped a finger into the knot of her bootlace and retied it slower as if repetition could make something last longer. I pointed out the slant of smoke 3 ridges over and said the word /pile, and they each in their way added it to their private dictionaries. On the way down, the tower stairs didn't creak as much. Our feet made their own proofs. Near the bottom, Leo paused over a spider web that had caught the whole geometry of the corner. The spider wasn't home. A seed fluff had drafted into the web and hung there, a tiny paratrooper considering its choices. Lila put her palm under it and blew gentle. The fluff unhooked and took its work elsewhere. Back on the road, we turned toward the Alvarez place without talking about it. The driveway ran between rows of trees older than any of us, their limbs propped like elders resting elbows on canes. Apples sat in the grass like drop coins. The house was a squat square white with a green roof porch posts, painted with the careful hand of someone who fixes what can be fixed and leaves the rest to show its age. "Observers," I said. Same thing he said, which made Leo grin. He showed us the scion wood he'd cut in winter, labeled in his tidy print, Gravenstein Ashmead's Colonel Esopus Spitzenberg, names that taste better than they sound. On a bench under the lean-to, he set a rootstock upright and opened a tea in the bark with a knife he kept sharper than his humor. He rolled a bud from a Gravenstein twig between his fingertips, slid it under the bark, tied it in with a rubber strip quick as a laced boot. "You're saving the old trees," Lila said, as if she were making sure she'd read the sign right. "I'm giving the old taste a young set of legs," Buck said. "Trees forget what they are if you don't help them remember." He passed the knife to Ray without ceremony and watched her with his hands in his back pockets, the way a person watches a dog at a gate, ready to open it or not, depending. Ray set her thumb where he had slid the steel, careful, open the bark in a neat T. Her breath stayed steady. The bud slipped under like it had been waiting since winter. Buck let the corner of his mouth move 1 notch. He gave her the strip to tie. She made it tight without strangling the graft. Leo wanted the knife next, and I stood close without saying I was standing close. He cut a crooked T and then straightened it with 2 short strokes, face set, like he was making his own weather. Lila pressed the rubber strips into my palm one by one, passing them like a nurse. Buck cut us slices from an apple he kept in his shirt pocket and said, "Here's September and June." The flesh had that green wine snap when we bit. Leo chewed like a machine. Lila closed her eyes 1 second. Ray's tongue found something in it she didn't have a word for and didn't ask for one. The orchard held us for a while. Bees worked the clover patches low between the trunks with a note that made the whole place hum like a big instrument. Buck pointed at a row and told a story about a family who'd moved away and left their tree to fend for itself, and how a taste can skip a generation if you're not careful. He showed Ray the clipped ends of a binding where last year's graft had taken. She ran her finger over the smooth union new wood blending with old like scar and skin swapping names. When we turned back toward the truck, Buck pressed a folded paper bag into my hand. Scions wrapped in damp newspaper labeled in his tight print. "If you've got rootstock," he said. "I've got places," I said. Ray kept the bag against her sternum all the way to the gate, like it had a pulse. At the fence, she stopped and cleared her throat without meaning to. "Nell," she said. "Yes, if I wanted to." She held the bag out and let it rest again, as if a different answer lay in either position. If I wanted to keep learning like this. Not only summers would the school back home let me do classes from here. There's a dual enrollment program in our district. I checked last night on the library Wi-Fi by the fuel dock, just the website, not videos. She said it cleanly, not selling, and not asking permission, laying the question down like a tool on a bench to see if it fit the hand it was meant for. I looked at her at the easy way her shoulders weighted and balanced themselves now at the pencil parked behind her ear, because her hand had put it there without asking her head. Leo had found a red ladybug on the gatepost and was letting it make a loop from knuckle to knuckle. Lila had the rubber strips coiled on her wrist like a bracelet. "We can talk," I said. The answer matched the size of the moment, no bigger. We walked to the truck with the scions between us. Down the road, the ridge kept its usual blue. Up in the back, Lila sorted the rubber strips into even lengths and slid them into the glove box with a solemnity that would have looked like play to someone not paying attention. Leo put the ladybug on the dashboard and watched it choose its own direction. Ray set the paper bag on her lap and held it with both hands as if thanks could be weight. The tires found the ruts they always find. The orchard gate swung its arc and settled back against the post, keeping its own counsel. Morning came with a north wind that combed the grass in one direction and kept it there. The inlet went gray and choppy, the kind of surface that tells you to keep your feet on land. I set the field bags by the door and didn't touch them. If they were going to lead, they'd have to claim the straps themselves. Leo got there first. He swung a bag onto his shoulder like a fireman stepped into his boots, then stopped at the tide chart as if it were a turnstile. "Low was early," he said, squinting at my pencil marks. "So the back trail will be damp. That's good for tracks." He was talking to himself, but the room let him. He took us up the narrow path that ran behind the cabin into a pocket of forest where the wind smoothed out and the ferns held a darker green. Here, he said, satisfied with himself for finding a place before I did. A windfall lay across the trail, a cedar trunk gone down years ago, its back furred with moss, and its belly softened to brown sponge. He knelt and put 2 fingers to the moss like a doctor reading a pulse. "Nurse log," he said, tasting the term. He lifted a slab of bark slow, then slower, and we all leaned in. Underneath was a world the sun hadn't been told about. Pale threads of mycelium, a line of ants ferrying some cargo the size of an idea beetle galleries cut into the old wood like maps of a city. A ground beetle, glossy as spilled ink, fixed us with the kind of look a beetle has, and then chose its own direction. Leo took a breath so he wouldn't yell. He put the bark back exactly as it had been, aligning a notch he'd noticed. "There," he said to the log, not to us. We moved on at his pace, which was upgrade and stall the rhythm of a kid willing to be surprised. He found a tree with a lightning scar and pressed his cheek to the smooth, pale wound. He found a woodpecker's ladder of holes and traced them with his finger. When we crossed the seep moss slick as felt water beating up through the earth, he made us step on the stones he'd already tested and held out his hand for Lila, as if she were the one who might fall. The wind pressed harder by mid-morning. Back at the cabin, Whitecap stitched the inlet and the fir tops thrashed their irritation. The weather radio mentioned gusts, small craft warnings, the kind of tidy phrases that keep fishermen honest. Lila stood at the door and watched the sets roll across the bar. She fixed the sight line in her head and turned to us with a small declarative voice. "Rule is hose height. If a wave could wash a hose across the deck, we don't go down." "Copy," I said. She took it as the compliment it was. The house asked for inside work. We answered. I brought the coil of magnet wire from a drawer, a cardboard tube, a handful of thumbtacks, a germanium diode from a pill bottle that had once held something for a more official ailment. On the table, we set it all out, the way you lay a meal to see what it wants to be, Radio Leo said, recognizing the shape before it was made. But not the talking kind. Crystal, I said. It steals from the air and gives back in whispers. He wound the wire around the tube with the kind of care he had not before this week given anything slower than a ball. Lila counted raps and tens, head tilted, eyes soft with focus. Ray handled the knife for the insulation scrapes like she'd used it for years, shaving off just enough lacquer to show Copper's clean face. We pressed thumbtacks into the cardboard, mapped a little circuit, clipped a cat's whisker to the diode, and pinched the old earphone between two palms to persuade it to behave. Now, Leo asked, barely letting air move his lips. Now. He put the earphone to his head and frowned, then lit up. He held it out to Lila without being told. She listened, and her eyebrows made a question mark that didn't need a mouth. Ray took her turn last, and when she heard the thin, sandy voice of the weather band say, "Seas 4 to 6, as if that were an ordinary sentence she wrote, heard with nothing but wire in her notebook. The wind hit and passed like a hand over the roof. The cabin took the push and gave it back a little creak, a little settle. We let the dough from the morning rise to the mark on the jar, folded it like a letter, let it rise again." Leo floured the counter too generously and laughed when he drew a map of the coast with the heel of his hand. Lila scored the loaves in a pattern that would make sense once the oven had its say. Ray brushed flour off the table into a neat palm and emptied it into the bin by tapping her wrist. In the afternoon, the weather put down its shoulders. The light returned to the table as if called to a shift. I brought out a box of things I'd been saving: clothespins, postcard blanks, a blue packet of cyanotype paper, a bundle of thin dowels, a drawer pull that had lost its screw. Museum Leo said at once, happy to name something before it grew. We set the living room like a small traveling fair. Lila swept the floor and drew a line of tape to mark a path that felt natural without telling your feet what to do. Leo made stands out of driftwood slivers and clothespins for the labels he was going to write, and when he ran out of clothespins, he fashioned more with a hinge of wire and a flat of cedar. Ray chose the window ledge for the tide map she'd drawn and weighted the corners with smooth beach stones, aligning the margins with the frame, as if precision could invite attention. We made cyanotypes on the deck while the sun held steady. Lila arranged seaweed on the blue paper, combed the edges with her fingers until the fronds lay flat, then slid the sheets into a tray for rinsing. The white silhouettes bloomed where the sun had been blocked. The rest turned an oceanic deep, the color of a bruise that means work done well. Leo printed a crab claw and held it up as if it were a new constellation. Ray printed her compass, the lines coming out ghostly and exact. Labels multiplied. Tide map, outer break. Ray H. Nurse log. Beetle galleries. Leo H. kelp. Holdfast found North Cove. Lila H. The H stood for haze and for habit. They didn't ask whether to sign them. They knew. In the kitchen, Ray took the end of the table and made it into an office without saying that's what she was doing. She spread her notebook, opened a folder, slid a blank sheet to the center as if she were aligning a lens. The heading at the top read, in her clear hand, Independent Study Coastal Ecology Proposal. She wrote sentences that treated adults like they could handle plain talk, how coursework would meet standards, what supervision would look like, where and when assessments would happen, what she would do if a storm cut the line between the cabin and town. She didn't list everything. She built a page that could hold a conversation without wobbling. Lila brought over a cup of water and set it near Ray's paper, careful enough that the rim didn't leave a ring. For the desk, she said. Thanks, Ray said, without looking up, which meant she meant it. Leo, who had not been asked to sit still in longer than he could remember, sat on the floor and sharpened pencils to the exact length that made his hand feel honest. He tied each one with a bit of twine and set them like kindling in a jar. He printed "Do not touch" with eyes on a card and taped it to the shelf with the pelican skull, then stood back and admired the firmness of the statement. The loaves came out of the oven with a sound like a shoulder loosening. We broke one open at the counter and ate in halves, butter softening to the crust, as if someone had whispered a magic word. The house smelled like warmth made visible. The wind had gone where wind goes when it has other work. By evening, the museum was its own room inside the room. The pop-up path led by the drift bench past the cyanotypes clipped along a string line to the window, where the tide maps sat in a row that made sense to anyone who has ever watched water choose a route. Each label stood without apology. Nothing had been bought for the purpose. Everything told where it had come from and why it looked the way it did. Ray set her pages in a plain folder and slid a pencil behind her ear. She stood in the doorway and took the museum in as if it were a weather front. Lila smoothed the tape line one last time with the side of her thumb and then peeled the last wrinkle flat. Leo switched off the overhead light and clicked on the small lamp by the maps, so the blues deepened and the whites went tender. The room held its breath and then let it out a little quieter than before. The inlet kept talking in its long language. The eagles were somewhere dark and high keeping their own accounts. The tide chart's pencil marks told what had been true and were done telling it. On the table, the crystal radio lay in parts again, wire-coiled diode tucked into its bottle earphone sleeping in a dish. It would go back together when hands wanted it to. The cabin took the weight of the day and distributed it to the shelves, the floorboards, the hooks. We sat where we belonged and didn't have to say we'd gotten there. By late morning, the tape line on the floor lay smooth under Lila's thumb. She'd pressed every wrinkle flat. Leo adjusted the lamp so the cyanotypes glowed ocean deep along the string. Ray stood at the window folder in hand, spine straight without trying. The bread from last night's bake still scented the room, a warm note under the iodine breath drifting in from the inlet. I heard the SUV before I saw it, clean engine plight tires. It nosed into the pullout and idled a moment, as if the car itself was deciding. Mark climbed out taller than the last time, or maybe standing different. Sloane followed sunglasses big enough to hold their own weather. The rear doors stayed shut until his key chirped the locks twice the way you do when you're telling yourself you've done the right thing, Mom, Mark said, and then quieter hi. Hi, I said. The kids stepped out in a line that wasn't rehearsed but looked like it. Leo sunbrowned at the cheekbones, Lila steady in her boots, Ray with a pencil behind her ear as if she'd been born with it there. You're taller, Sloane said to Leo, which is the same as saying you've been gone. Inside the cabin kept its voice low. Sloane paused just over the threshold, cedar salt old map, a shadow of heat still in the stove iron. Her gaze skimmed shelves and stopped at the pelican skull. The sunglasses came off a notch. Mark looked once at the big window and let his shoulders answer something. We made a museum, Leo said, and then swallowed that word and tried a different one. We put our stuff where you can see it. Lila pointed to the tape path. This way, she said, not bossy, just sure. They moved the room in a small procession. At the tide maps, Ray stayed back while Mark leaned in. She'd drawn the breaks so their lines told you what the water had decided yesterday and how it had changed its mind. You did these? He said, no question in it. Ray nodded once. At the shelf with the holdfast and the nurse log drawing, Leo stood square and read his label out loud, then didn't need to keep reading. We don't take anything alive, he said instead. And if you lift a rock, you put it back exactly. Or the crabs have to move. He caught himself check the room, then added, they shouldn't have to. Sloane lifted her chin at the cyanotypes. These are pretty, she said, and the word landed clumsily between compliment and apology. Lila smoothed a corner. Sun prints, she said. You can do them with leaves or a crab claw. We rinsed them in the big bowl so the blue wouldn't run down the drain. We ended at the window ledge. The inlet wore a midday shine chopped a little by the north wind. Ray held the folder with both hands and set it on the table the way you put a tool down where it belongs. She looked at Mark first, then at Sloane. I wrote something, she said, and opened the cover. It's a proposal. Sloane's shoulders climbed. Mark reached without being told. Ray didn't perform, she described. There was a program back in their district, dual enrollment, the kind that takes a serious student and lets her split time between approved work and the old desks. Tests in person when required, the rest submitted clean and on time. She said Buck's name once as a source, not a shield. She said mine twice in the sentences about oversight that adults listen for. Her voice didn't push. It carried. No, Sloane said quick as a drawer slammed. Ray, you have friends, clubs. College looks at those. This, she gestured at the room, at the inlet, at the idea. This is charming. It isn't school. Mark kept reading. He turned a page and went back to the first, the way you do when you find yourself agreeing and need to check who started that. He set one finger on the line about assessments. He looked at me, then at the kids, then at the window where the tide ran its blunt errands. The radio on the shelf cracked and found Channel 3 without asking. Buck's voice came in soft with wind on it. Nail you up. 2 grays off the point moving south close in. Good water. If you got folks around who like the kind of show you don't pay for. Leo's eyes went to me like a dog's goes to the door. I lifted the microphone. Copy, I said. Thanks. We walked to the bluff, no ceremony, just feet finding the path they knew. The wind laid our hair in one direction. Out beyond the bar, the surface rose in a double boil and broke in 2 low spouts, twin white exhale quick as a sigh and twice as loud. The backs lifted slate and wet and real and rolled down again like they'd never belonged to air. A 3rd spout farther out, a 4th. The ridge threw its shadow, the sea kept its color. Sloane took off her sunglasses and didn't put them back on. I've only ever seen them in a boat, she said, and then didn't make that into anything. Mark shaded his eyes with his hand. Leo started counting and stopped. Lila stood with her mouth open just enough to be breath. Ray watched the line after the spout as closely as the spout. She didn't write. There are times when the pencil stays in your pocket. Back in the cabin, the room had shifted by a degree you could feel and not name. Mark set the folder on the table again and kept his palm on it 1 second longer than needed. I don't want to throw this away, he said to the page and to Ray both. I mean, he corrected himself without looking at Sloane, dismiss. I don't want to dismiss it. Sloane held the spine of the shorebird guide like it might take flight. We have a life, she said, but it was softer now, as if the word we had moved its furniture. She looked at Ray. I'm not promising, she added, because she didn't make promises she didn't control. I'm not saying yes. I hear you. Ray didn't nod. She kept her hands flat on the table, steady as a level. Thank you, she said. We ate the heel of the bread with cheese because it was there. The kids made small explanations without performing. Leo about the crystal set, Lila about the rules she called hose height. Ray about the map's outer break, their voices coming from the place in the chest that doesn't shout. Mark tasted the bread as if he remembered something through it. Sloane held her mug with both hands and looked around the room again slower. Goodbyes took the shape they always do and none of the edges. Lila's hug was firm at the beginning and lighter at the end, like she knew how to set her weight now. Leo's was quick and cracked something in his throat he tried to laugh through. Ray's was 2 arms and then a step back, and a look straight on, not a test, just a look. At the door, Mark put his hand on the frame I'd planed myself when the old pine had given up. I built something with Dad once, he said, as if he'd found the thought under the floorboards. On your porch. The summer before school. You did, I said. He nodded like he'd seen a star he remembered the name of. Dust lifted as the SUV took the bend. The inlet kept its talk going. I set the radio back to weather and turned it low. On the table, the folder lay where Ray had left it, square to the grain. The science Buck had given us sat in a jar by the sink, paper damp, labels tight. The tide chart waited with its pencil string. The cabin, relieved of voices, took one long breath and returned it to the room, cedar and salt and yeast, writing it enough to measure and enough to keep. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If this story resonated with you or made you reflect, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story.